Whenever there is talk about Caesar and what he wanted to do with the Republic, the claim that Caesar wanted to introduce a monarchy in Rome comes up. This was the viewpoint of the history textbook I studied from, and it's the same viewpoint that Wikipedia broadcasts. There's only one problem, though. It has no proof. Caesar, unfortunately, has not left us any texts that would describe his plan of action, and all we know are either the stories of his enemies or historians who reproduce the version broadcast by Augustus. And since Gaius Octavius himself was Caesar's heir and the creator of the Roman monarchy, then Caesar is counted among the supporters of this idea. Here also go measures to centralize the Republic, and here, the myth is ready. Uncrowned king of Rome who simply did not have time to be crowned. But is it true? I think not. Caesar, in a certain sense, like his successor Octavian, was a republican. Another thing is that after the war with the Pompeians, the Republic was in a comatose state, and the fact that it could not go on like this, Caesar understood very well. That is why he began to carry out reforms. The way to him marked Sulla, a lifetime dictatorship to save the Republic. The set of levers in this case would be enough. In the hands of Gaius, the best army that Rome has seen, but instead he begins to play politics, legitimizing his rule with the help of republican traditions. The same mechanisms that would later form the basis of Augustus's power, the powers of people's tribune and consul, extraordinarily renewed year after year, are employed. Yes, this is a violation of republican traditions, but Sulla had already once broken the rules to save the Republic, and therefore Caesar had the moral right to do so. Especially since his program of reforms, which he for the brevity of the reign did not have time to implement the whole, was really revolutionary. What did he propose? Unification, centralization, Romanization. Caesar was clearly aware of two structural problems of Rome: the hypertrophied position in the state of the Roman nobility, whose interests diverged from the interests of the subjugated peoples, and too much power in the hands of magistrates. The solution to these problems he engaged in. First, in all of Italy, as well as part of the old provinces, there are no longer different types of citizenship. All receive the rights of the Romans. Secondly, the Code of Julius is introduced, which unifies many local laws with Roman laws, unifies the system of local government, and guarantees Roman rights and freedoms. This ensures uniformity of government, based on local popular assemblies with a Senate of the elected and magistrates, reproducing the system that had already proved itself perfectly well for the administration of the Roman community. Thirdly, there is administrative reform. Parts of the provinces are split into smaller entities, more convenient for administration. It can be assumed that in the future all provinces would have been fragmented in order to weaken the power of each of the viceroys. The scheme of interaction with the locals was also changing. The institution of pomps, which had ruined the provinces, was abolished. Now the viceroy had to ensure the collection of taxes exclusively through local self-government bodies, through the nobility provincials. All this served to more fully integrate the provincial aristocracy into the Roman aristocracy, or more precisely, into the all-republican aristocracy. The next steps were a logical continuation of the previous ones, but affected the governance of the Republic itself. First, the number of senators was expanded by introducing representatives of the provinces, as well as horsemen. This decision aroused the anger of old provincials like Cicero, who for years had been proving to the old patrician families that he was just like them, and now others like him got access to the Senate for nothing. But this decision at the root destroyed the influence of the old Roman factions. Now they were far from being a majority and had to put up with representatives of the provinces, each of whom had their own interests, different from the Roman nobility. The same purpose was pursued by the increase in the number of magistrates, which now had access to the provincials. Caesar consistently expanded the political base of the Republic, while undermining the very foundations of the opposition between the optimates and populares. The new provincial aristocracy could not share the ideas of the optimates as they were directed against them, but they were not completely Caesarian either. The process of genesis of new parties based on completely different principles started, which is proved by the introduction of horsemen, merchants into the Senate, which was a nonsense for classical Rome. Finally, even more strengthened the foundation of the Republic that Caesar began to implement the program of Gracchus, adopted a series of laws aimed at redistribution of land in Italy in favor of small owners, mass withdrawal of colonies in the conquered provinces, measures to recount land and population. Caesar, for the first time for hundreds of years in principle, solves the land question, in addition, creating in each province a powerful layer of Romans, often veterans, who became the backbone of Roman power. The very vector of reforms shows that Caesar, on the one hand, weakens the old Roman parties, weakens the importance of individual magistrates, but not the magistracy, retaining the full extent of their power, and at the same time expands their base. Now the Senate is not Rome, but really the Republic. Caesar finally shifts the center of gravity of politics in the Senate, while the commissions, people's meetings, remains the role of solving inner-city issues, as now the inhabitants of Rome alone can no longer decide issues important to the entire Republic. Increasing the Senate, Caesar on the one hand made it sluggish and inert, but on the other hand it would protect it from distortions, as one-step increase in influence now became much more difficult. Nevertheless, Caesar carefully sidestepped the twin issues of the army and his own position. Dictatorship, as well as control over the army, was really just a tool, but having achieved stabilization of the regime would inevitably arise the question of transferring power to the heir, and that's where we enter shaky ground. Caesar either did not want to raise these issues at all, preferring the decision of Sulla, to retire when everything is done, or did not have time. Both options are possible, and both carry many pitfalls. And yet, given the pace of Caesar's reforms and the fact that in his will, prepared in advance and clearly thought out in case he left the world prematurely without completing his work, there was no mention of anyone taking his place or another high magistracy, although it was in Caesar's power to do so, which suggests that the latter thought the system he was creating was stable enough that his followers could achieve in it by legitimate republican means superiority over their opponents. The provincials were for Caesarians, and so for the first few decades, Caesar's party was protected and his reforms continued. The stone that derailed the train of Caesar's republic was the fact that the republic resurrected by the dictator did not have developed checks and balances. Caesar himself refused to repress dissenters, himself sought compromise with everyone. He was the center of the republic, its cement, without having time to create a new structure to keep the building from falling. The expectation of unity within his supporters failed simply because the Caesarians had never been monolithic. Proponents of reorganization in the style of Eastern despotisms like Mark Antony neighbored here with supporters of a soft course, to which Octavian joined. And funny enough, they had the same goal, to unite the Republic into a single whole, but the means were quite different. Obviously, Caesar left too soon. Caesar's course turned out to be only his course, but not the course of all Caesarians. It is obvious that Octavian was not ready. At the time of Caesar's death, he was an empty place, which acquired a certain value because on him Caesar had piled most of his material resources, while the intangible resources, connections, went to Antony. Probably Gaius Octavius was prepared not for a military, but for a political career as the leader of the Senate faction of Caesarians. At least this would explain that he was kept quite far from the battlefield, although the future dictator and lord of armies should be on the front line and get used to military life. But Octavius was kept away. Perhaps here purely my assumption, but the final point of Caesar's reforms would be the decentralization of the army. This step was logical, as in this case no magistrate could not get sole control over a fairly large army. Respectively, the army would again be taken out of politics and therefore the future heir enough general knowledge of military service, since the power is transferred without the participation of the legions. All these are as usual hypotheses based on the analysis of the actions of a man who died more than 2,000 years ago. He tried to save the Republic, but in the process he died himself and the Republic died after him. The fact that 30 years later we'll spend over the corpse of the Republic will be a rite of necromancy, but who knows what the story would be if Caesar lived 10 years longer.